A question that often comes back is multiverse. What comics do you read? Let's find out. Hello, heroes and villains. Welcome to Multiverse. So today we are going to take a look at Superman, the Man of Steel, Volume 1. Basically, it's a compilation that compiles a whole bunch of comics from John Byrne, Jerry Ordway, and probably a few others I forget. It's a really nice book. I do have the hardcover version, and it's a really nice book that has some really thick. It's not the glossy paper. It's not the newsprint either. It's like a very thick bond paper, and it's a really nice quality. But once in a while, there are some sales on Kindle. Sometimes, like when there's a movie coming up and there's a comic about that movie, sometimes that comic will be on sale with Kindle. Or during Christmas, also, like for Boxing Day or for Black Friday, there was quite a few sales on Amazon for Kindle comics. So I was able to buy basically all four volumes. There's four volumes total. Today we are going to take a look at volume one. We'll take a look at the other volumes a bit later. Although before we start looking at volume 1, basically for me it all started here. Basically at some point I reached a point in time where I thought, okay, maybe I'm getting too old to be reading comics. Maybe it's time for me to leave those childish things behind me. So I reached a point at some point where I wasn't reading comics anymore. I thought I was getting too old for comics. And then one day as I was coming back home, I saw in the spinner rack the comic you're seeing right now. It was like I was hit with a Warhammer, a jackhammer, whatever hammer, and I had to pick up that comic. I had no choice. And then later on, I went back to the comic store and bought a whole bunch of back issues of Superman by John Byrne, Action Comics by John Byrne, and of course the Man of Steel miniseries. Way back when, we did not have trade paperbacks, but what comic stores would do is that they would take back issues, like in the case of, let's say, the Man of Steel miniseries, they would put all of them together, all six issues together, like in a plastic bag, and they would sell you the whole run that way. So it was the closest we had to trade paperback way back when, although ironically enough, the Man of Steel miniseries would actually have a trade paperback. If you bought all six issues, within each issue you had some sort of coupon that you could tear out, and if you sent all six coupon, like $20 I think, they would send you a Man of Steel trade paperback with a brand new cover by John Byrne that you're seeing right now. And also in the volume, there's a pretty inspiring introduction by John Byrne. I basically talk about his background and some of his influences, and for a young comic artist like I was way back when, it was a very inspiring piece to read. So obviously in this volume we do have the cover for the trade paperback from way back when, but the original cover of the comic is this cover here. The cover would be made with a nice pinup, but also there would be a scene relevant to the story. So with that we have the classic Superman opening up his shirt with the destruction of Krypton behind him. And speaking of Krypton, basically for this series, John Byrne literally reinvented Krypton. So Krypton no longer looked like something straight out of the 70s. He tried to make it look more like an alien culture. But it would still be the classic origin with Krypton about to explode. So we would see how Kal-El became the last son of Krypton. And way back when they were trying to pretty much bring back to Superman being the last son of Krypton. So they got rid of a whole bunch of stuff like Krypto the super dog, Streaky the super cat, the super horse, and a whole bunch of other Kryptonians. Although it lasted only for a while, already right off the bat, it became clear that they needed to have a Superboy to explain why the Legion of Superheroes existed. The Legion of Superheroes were based on Superboy. So no Superboy, no Legion of Superheroes. So right off the bat, they pretty much had to bring back Superboy. They had to create a pocket universe from which Superboy was coming from. But it's something we'll see in the next volume. And already way back when, they were trying to go against expectation. Here we had Superman basically being a football player in high school, where historically he was never a football player. There was a whole bunch of reasons why he should not be a football player, but the best way to explain why he should not be a football player was by Jonathan Kent in the Superman the movie. Basically, he tells him that he knows that he's meant for something important, he's meant for something more. He doesn't know what that is just yet, but there's one thing he does know. It wasn't to score touchdown. It was pretty much the with great powers comes great responsibility line that was applied to Superman. So basically, Superman was here not to profit from his powers, which is he easily could have done playing football. He was meant to do more than that, and that would explain also why he never tried to profit from using his powers or make money from it and all that stuff. So of course we have the scene where Pa Kent reveals that Superman doesn't come from Earth, although they don't quite know just yet. At first they think he might be maybe Russian or something. Maybe it's a Russian spaceship or something like that. But later on in the story, they will pretty much establish that now he does come from an evil alien planet called Krypton. Yeah, I'm just having a bit of fun with the evil part. Basically, they had just reached a point where they were pretty much emotionless. They had pretty much gotten rid of emotions, so they were not really evil. But in a nutshell, the first issue is pretty much to re-establish the origin of Superman, which sadly would influence a lot of people to do the same later on. I guess not everyone agreed with some of the changes that John Byrne did to the Superman mythos, and also some people were desperately trying to bring back the Krypton from the 70s. But so we saw quite a few reinterpretation of the Superman origin. There was a storyline at some point with Ed McGuinness, and I forget who the writer was, where literally they went back to the Krypton from the 70s. But then later on, there was a Mark Bright with the Birthright miniseries, again trying to retell the Superman origin. We had the Secret Origin by Jeff Jones and Gary Frank, again trying to reinvent the Superman origin story. Not to mention probably other things like Superman Earth 1 by Shane Davis and J. Michael Straczynski, and probably others. So sadly, there's been, ever since Man of Steel by John Byrne, there's been this tug of war amongst the creators to pretty much reinvent the origin of Superman and reinvent Krypton. So sadly, some creators afterwards could not just let it go and continue with the Krypton origin or the Superman origin by John Byrne. They had to try to reinvent the wheel at every opportunity. Not to mention also, basically John Byrne took, the origin of Superman was like 3-4 panels in the original Superman comics, and that was it. And John Byrne pretty much took those 3-4 panels and pretty much made a whole comics out of those 3-4 panels. And it's a trend that sadly would only get worse as time goes by. Later on, there's Brian Michael Bendis who would say, "Hold my beer," and he would take the 15 pages Spider-Man story and turn it into like a 6 or 8 issue storyline. So Man of Steel number 1 would pretty much take a whole issue to retell the Superman origin story, but also the first 6 issues would try to sort of reestablish Superman in this new setting. So the second issue would be to pretty much reintroduce Lois Lane and pretty much establish the new relationship with this new Superman and this new version of Lois Lane. And the same with issue 3 with the Batman. Also in the case of Batman, obviously you had Frank Miller who was sort of reinventing Batman, although not really. Even though Frank Miller was sort of reinventing Batman with Batman Year 1, and had sort of reinvented Batman with The Dark Knight Returns, Batman pretty much remained pretty much the same. They did tweak him a little bit, they did try to make him more like the Dark Knight detectives, but overall he was pretty much the same Batman. Heck, at the time we had the Crisis on Infinite Earths that pretty much reinvented the entire DC universe. We had Michael W. Barr and Alan Davis who were working on Detective Comics, and the Batman in Detective Comics was pretty much the same after Crisis than before Crisis. But overall, they were trying to make Batman a little bit darker, and not so much because of Batman Year 1, more because of The Dark Knight Returns. And here you can see, I loved how sometimes John Byrne would play with Batman with just a silhouette where he would put the black part of the costume or the blue part of the costume completely black and create a pretty cool silhouette effect. And also Batman having the long bat ears, you could put it all in silhouette and still understand that this is the Batman thanks to his unique design. And then with the fourth issue, we had to reintroduce Superman's relationship with Lex Luthor and how they became mortal enemies. But also, they would use that issue to try to reintroduce Lois Lane a little bit. They would try to make her more modern, especially with the hairstyle. John Byrne decided to give her a more modern hairstyle than the classic hairstyle she had for a long time. And also, even clothing wise, he was trying to pretty much update her wardrobe. And also, there's something with Lois Lane that's always been weird. Lois Lane has always been portrayed as the best reporter of the Daily Planet. Even way back when Superman was first introduced, she was already working at the Daily Planet, and she was already the best reporter they had. And later on, they even made her Prize Pulitzer winner. But somehow that never was enough. Whenever people thought of Lois Lane, they just thought of the lady who got saved by Superman. And I always thought that was a bit unfair. I think people who always thought that never read a single comics, because within the comics, Lois Lane was made as a very, very strong character. She was the best reporter the Little Planet had. She was a Pulitzer Prize winner. And also, in Man of Steel, they reinvented her her father is Sam Lane, a general, and they pretty much made her an army brat, so she could fight on her own if she had to. But somehow there's some people who probably never read comics ever, who think that there's no strong female in comics. But we've had strong females for a long, long time, one of them being Lois Lane. And the final issue would pretty much reestablish Superman's link with Smallville. They would pretty much establish that he comes from Krypton. That is where he would pretty much meet Jor-El for the first time. He would meet some sort of hologram version of Jor-El, and he would see a hologram version of Krypton, and from that moment, he would know where he comes from. Before that, he kind of knew he wasn't from Kansas, but now, in this issue, they pretty much cemented that he is Kal-El of Krypton, and he is not from Earth. But, ironically enough, by the end of the comic, he realizes that he is from Earth. First he was born on Earth. The way John Byrne made the story, the original story, he made it so that the ship that leaves Krypton is actually a birthing matrix. So Superman is not quite born just yet. When the birthing matrix reaches Earth and then opens, that is when Superman was born. And basically, it was an attempt by John Byrne to make Superman an American. He wanted Superman not to be an immigrant, but to be born on American soil. So even though Superman came from Krypton, he was born on Earth, he was raised in Kansas, he was American. But sadly, that is something that would be unmade as time went by future creators. What can you do? Also, there is this weird obsession about making Superman a Christ-type figure. Superman is not a Christ allegory. If anything, Superman is a Moses allegory. He's the ultimate immigrant. But somehow along the way, things got confused, or creators got confused, or they just tried to hijack Superman for their own agenda, which sadly is something that happens way too often these days. And then we got a brand new Superman #1. Basically, the DC wanted John Byrne to be drawing the main Superman title, but they also wanted him to draw a Superman #1 comic. So decisions, what shall we do? It's quite simple. What they ended up doing is that they ended up renaming the old Superman comic into The Adventures of Superman. So the numbering would continue within that comic, and for the start of John Byrne on the ongoing Superman series, they would restart with a fresh new series, with a fresh new #1, and in this issue, he fights the evil Metallo. Also, there would be a nice treat. Basically, Terry Austin, the same guy who inked John Byrne when he was working on the X-Men, Terry Austin would come back to ink John Byrne on Superman, at least for a while. Although afterwards we would get some pretty good inkers. We got Carl Kessel. I always loved the work of Carl Kessel. And I loved Carl Kessel inking John Byrne on the Legends miniseries. And I was quite happy to see him ink him in the pages of Superman as well. And there's Action Comics that was turned into a team-up book. So John Byrne was doing 2 books a month. He was writing and drawing 2 books a month, Superman and Action Comics. And he even managed to write a few annuals, to draw a few short stories. John Byrne at the time was a machine. And this issue of Action Comics was quite a treat. It featured the Teen Titans, and this is the incarnation around the time where George Perez was on the book, although this probably was a bit after Perez left the book, but it was still pretty much the Marv Wolfman, George Perez Teen Titans, even though George Perez was no longer in the book at the time. It was by far the best incarnation of the Teen Titans. For Action Comics, the inking would be done by Dick Giordano. I always liked his inking, especially when he was inking Neil Adams. Although from what I understand, it wasn't quite Dick Giordano himself that was doing the inking. From what I understand, he had his own studio, and he had a small army of inkers working for him. So sometimes the ink would look a bit rough, especially compared to the inking by Terry Austin, and later on by Carl Kessel. Here we have a nice beauty shot. It's something that John Byrne would do from time to time. He would have a nice beauty shot of Superman flying above the city, and it was always a treat. And as I mentioned, basically what they ended up doing was that they would rename the ongoing Superman comic to The Adventures of Superman so that John Byrne could have a Superman number one. And The Adventures of Superman was written by Marv Wolfman and drawn by Jerry Ordway. Although I think at some point John Byrne also started writing Adventures of Superman, or maybe Jerry Ordway was writing it. I seem to recall that Marv Wolfman stuck around for about a year and then later on was replaced by someone else. So we had some pretty good Jerry Ordway artwork. Jerry Ordway was heavily influenced by Wallace Wood, and whenever I look at Jerry Ordway's work, I cannot help but see the Wallace Wood influence. Although his art wasn't quite as flashy as, let's say, John Byrne, as spectacular as John Byrne, it was a great draftsmanship. The storytelling, though, was quite different, and we would not get the nice beauty shots that John Byrne would give us from time to time. So again, Action Comics had been turned into a team-up book. So the next issue would be Superman teamed up with the Phantom Stranger, and also at the time there was the Legends mini-series that was going on. So at the time, pretty much every comic were tied to the Legend miniseries, and it gave us a nice opportunity to see some new gods drawn by John Byrne, and some evil gods of Apocalypse. John Byrne was especially good when drawing Kirby characters. He understood Kirby like no one else, and he did not just copy Kirby, he pretty much enhanced it. It was awesome. So the Legend tie-in would continue then in the Adventures of Superman with a great cover by Jerry Ordway. Again, whenever I look at Jerry Ordway's art, I cannot help but see Wallace Wood. Love it. And of course, then the story continues in Action Comics. In this case, it would be Superman and the New Gods. It pretty much would be my introduction to Orion. I had seen Orion in the pages of the Legion of Superheroes, but it was during the Great Darkness saga. It wasn't really Orion, it was like a clone of Orion or something like that. That would fight the evil Darkseid like 1,000 years in the future. So this is truly the first time I truly encountered Orion. Loved it. I fell in love with the character right there and then, and he's by far my favorite new god, other than Darkseid maybe. And next we have the introduction of Bloodsport. You may remember Bloodsport. He was in the Suicide Squad movie by James Gunn. And here they were trying pretty much to sort of reestablish the relationship between Superman and Jimmy Olsen. And here we go back to the Adventures of Superman with Jerry Ordway. Again, you can see that his art, he has some great draftsmanship, great anatomy. His mastery of lighting and shadow is great. But he doesn't have artwork that is quite as spectacular as what John Byrne can produce. And in the ideal world, you would take Jerry Ordway, pair him up with a dynamic penciler, and you would end up with great work. He's a great finisher. He did some great finishing work over John Byrne, over George Perez, and many others. But when comes the time to do his own pencils, it's not quite as spectacular as some other pencilers, and it's a little stiff sometimes. Don't get me wrong, he's a great artist, but he does suffer from a problem that a lot of artists have. Sometimes when you see his original pencils, sometimes his original pencils are much more dynamic, have a lot more life than the final product. Sometimes he ends up basically killing the artwork when he does the inking. Basically, sometimes he'll take some of his pencils that is a bit more dynamic, and he'll make them a bit more stiff in the inking process. It is something that a lot of artists struggle with. Like even Jim Lee struggles with that. Sometimes I've seen some sketches by Jim Lee that were much stronger than the finished artwork. But I guess in the case of Jim Lee, even if the finished artwork is not as strong as the original artwork, his style is strong enough that it is still pretty strong, just not as strong as the original sketches. Technically, drawing is a process of making 1,000 decisions, and sometimes between the sketch and the let's say the finished pencils, there's thousands of decisions that happens. And if you make the wrong decisions, you can take a sketch that is very dynamic and end up pretty much killing it. Or even if you manage not to kill the sketch in the penciled stage, then once you ink it, again, there's another 1,000 decisions that you have to make during that process. And again, it's very easy to end up killing the pencils. Again, sometimes you have some very dynamic pencils that end up being not so dynamic once you're done with the inking process. It's sad, but it happens. And here we have Action Comics with the Demon. It was my introduction to the character, fell in love with it right there and then. I loved the little rhyme. Change, change, O form of man. Release the might from fleshy mire. Boil the blood in heart of fire. Gone, gone the form of man. Rise the demon, Etrigan. We saw that being used from time to time in the animated series or a few other places, and I always thought it wasn't quite as effective as it is used here on this page. Here we have a shot. I love this pose. This is a classic pose that John Byrne would use from time to time, and I love it. It's a very typical John Byrne pose that I've seen some people try to use something similar, but never as effective as the way John Byrne uses it. Love it. And here we have a great use of a silhouette and negative space, and we still understand that this is Superman. And then we got a few afterwards by Ray Bradbury, then we got an afterword by Marv Wolfman, and by Jerry Ordway. Sadly, if you try to read those on the PC, those are pretty difficult to read unless you have a really big screen. So ideally you will want a PC with touchscreen, or better yet, you will want to read it on the tablet with the Kindle app. So also we have a few covers by Jerry Ordway. Like again, Jerry Ordway is a great artist, but sadly when it comes to telling a story panel to panel, sometimes his storytelling is not as dynamic as it could be, or even some of his poses. Like this is a fine pose, just not very dynamic. And we have a few pages from Who's Who. Ironically enough, we have a whole bunch of characters from this volume, like you can see here, Amazing Grace, Bizarro. But we don't have the Who's Who page for Superman, unless it's in one of the future volumes, but I don't think it is. So we do have various Who's Who pages from various characters included in this volume, other than Host. Ironically enough, Host is not in this volume. Host will be in the next volume, in Superman the Man of Steel, Volume 2. And of course, we have the evil Lex Luthor. And we do have also a sort of Who's Who for Krypton, Kryptonite, and Kryptonians all rolled into one. And here we have Lois Lane. Again, this is a strong female character we've had for a long time, but somehow people don't seem to be aware of that. We have the evil Magpie. I'm not sure if John Byrne created Magpie or not. I seem to recall seeing her in a Batman annual before that. Here we have the evil Metallo, and that's pretty much the end of it. So we don't have the Who's Who for Superman, but we have a nice beauty shot with Superman to end the book. And for the back cover, they did use one of the covers that was done by Jerry Ordway way back when for one of the trade paperbacks. So the first volume is pretty much all about John Byrne in terms of writing and in terms of art. Although, again, The Adventures of Superman was written by Marv Wolfman and drawn by Jerry Ordway. But the lion's share of this first volume is pretty much done by John Byrne. There are 4 volumes total to this collection, and we see John Byrne a lot in those other volumes, but you'll see a bit more of Jerry Ordway in the other volumes. And you will see a few other artists like Ron Franz, Art Adams, Carl Kessel, and more. And there will also be a special treat of a story written by John Byrne, drawn by Kurt Swan, and inked by Jerry Ordway. But that will be a video for another time.